Christmas tree was still lit when I walked downstairs at 6 in the morning and realized the house was completely silent. Not the good kind of silent. Not the good kind where everyone is still sleeping and you pour your coffee and sit by the window and feel at peace with the world. This was the other kind. The kind that has a weight to it. The kind where the air feels wrong before you even understand why. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. Nothing. No movement from upstairs, and no shower running, no cartoon sounds leaking under my granddaughter's door. I checked the driveway through the front window. My daughter's SUV was gone. So was my son-in-law's truck. I told myself they had gone out early. Maybe to pick up something for dinner. We had plans. The whole family. Honey glazed ham, my wife's sweet potato casserole recipe that my daughter had been making since her mother passed. The good tablecloth that only comes out twice a year. It was Christmas morning. Where would anyone go at 6 in the morning on Christmas? I made my coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table. I waited. By 7:30, I started calling my daughter's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. I tried my son-in-law. Straight to voicemail, which meant his phone was either off or on Do Not Disturb. I sent a text, then another one. I sat there watching the little bubbles that meant the message had been delivered but not read. I went upstairs. My granddaughter's room was empty. Her stuffed rabbit was gone from the bed. The small rolling suitcase I had bought her for her birthday last spring was not in her closet. That was when I walked down the hall to the guest room, the room my daughter and her husband had been using for the past 11 months, and I opened the door. The closet was empty. The dresser drawers were pulled out and sitting open like they had packed in a hurry, or like they simply did not care enough to close them behind themselves. A few wire hangers on the closet rod. A single sock on the floor near the baseboard. The air smelled faintly of the cologne my son-in-law wore. Something expensive my daughter had bought him for his birthday on my credit card, though I did not know that at the time. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Then I walked to my desk in the study, opened my laptop, and logged into my bank account. I want you to understand something. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years working in commercial real estate in the Pacific Northwest. I have negotiated deals worth more than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. I know how to read a room. I know when something is wrong. I have seen betrayal in business, partners who stole, clients who lied. And I thought I had developed a kind of armor against it. The professional kind, anyway. Nothing prepares you for the personal kind. My checking account showed a balance of $412. It should have shown a balance just under $40,000. I had moved money there at the beginning of December, specifically because I had planned to pay off a lien on a property I own in eastern Oregon before the end of the year. $40,000, sitting in checking, for a purpose. Gone. I sat there for what must have been 10 minutes without moving. I went through the transaction history line by line. Between December 19th and December 23rd, 4 days, there had been 11 separate ATM withdrawals and 3 wire transfers. The withdrawals were $500 each, the maximum daily cash limit. The wire transfers went to an account I did not recognize. My daughter had been on my account for years. I had added her when her mother was sick, back when I needed someone who could handle things if I was at the hospital and a bill needed to be paid. I had never removed her. I trusted her. She was my daughter. I closed the laptop. I did not call the bank yet. I sat there in my study, in the house where I had lived for 22 years, in the house where my daughter had grown up, in the house where my wife had died, in the bedroom down the hall, and I looked at the Christmas tree through the study door, still blinking its slow-colored lights, and I made a decision. I was not going to be the person who falls apart. I was not going to call her 17 times and leave voicemails that I would later be ashamed of. I was not going to cry. I had cried enough in this house, in the years after her mother passed, and I had put myself back together once already, and I knew how to do hard things quietly. I picked up my phone and called my attorney. His name is Theodore, and I have known him for 25 years. And when I told him what I had found, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Don't touch anything in the house yet. I'll be there in an hour." Theodore arrived at 8:15. He is 71 years old and he brought coffee from the drive-through place on Route 9 because he knew I would not have eaten anything. We sat at the kitchen table and I walked him through everything I knew. The living arrangement had started in January of that year. My son-in-law, a man I will call by what he was, rather than his name, had lost his job the previous November. He had been in sales, something to do with medical devices, and the company had downsized their regional team. My daughter called me the week of Thanksgiving crying, saying they were behind on rent, that her husband was working on applications, that it was just temporary. Could they stay with me while they got back on their feet? I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my daughter. Her little girl was 7 years old, and I was not going to let my granddaughter sleep somewhere uncertain while my 4-bedroom house sat mostly empty. I said yes, move in whenever you're ready, take the whole upstairs if you need it. They moved in the second week of January with 2 carloads of boxes and more optimism than the situation seemed to warrant. My son-in-law shook my hand and told me he had 3 strong leads already and expected to be working again by spring. I told him to take his time and not rush into anything. I meant it sincerely. Spring came. He was still home. He had started doing things around the house, which I appreciated at first. He fixed the gutter on the south side that had been pulling away from the fascia. He repainted the fence along the back of the property. These things cost nothing but time, and I thought, all right, he is contributing in the way he can right now, and I did not press him about work. What I did not know at that point was that my daughter had told her husband about the trust. My wife and I had set up a living trust 17 years ago. When she passed, the assets consolidated and I became the sole trustee. The trust holds the house, 2 rental properties in Oregon, and a brokerage account. My daughter is named as the successor trustee and primary beneficiary. I had been open with her about this because I believed in transparency, because she was my daughter, because I thought she understood what those words, successor trustee, meant and did not mean. They mean that she would manage those assets after my death. They do not mean she has any access or authority while I am alive and competent. I was very much alive. I was very much competent. In March, my son-in-law started asking me questions. Casual ones, at first, over dinner. How does a living trust work? Do the properties go through probate? If you ever needed care, would those assets be protected? I answered him honestly, as I would have answered anyone curious about estate planning. I did not read it as what it was. In May, my daughter asked if she could be added to my checking account, just in case. She framed it as convenience. What if something happened to me and she needed to cover a bill quickly? I thought about it for a week. I talked to Theodore, who was not enthusiastic but said there were legitimate reasons to do it. I went ahead. She was my daughter. What I found out later, from the bank and from Theodore's investigator, is that starting in June, my son-in-law had been in contact with a real estate attorney in Portland. He had been quietly researching whether a successor trustee could petition for early management of trust assets if the current trustee was deemed to be making poor decisions. He found a couple of questionable legal opinions online, the kind that aren't worth the website they're printed on, and apparently convinced himself there was a path. There was no path, but in the meantime my daughter had his ear every day, and whatever he told her, whatever he had convinced her was possible, or justified, or coming to her eventually anyway, had turned her into someone I no longer recognized. I did not see this because I was not looking for it. A man does not watch his own daughter the way he would watch a business partner he had reason to distrust. I was her father. I had held her while she cried at her mother's funeral. I had driven her to piano recitals and soccer games and sat in the parking lot of her college on move-in day trying not to look like I was falling apart. You don't audit the people you love, you trust them. In late October, my daughter told me she was taking a solo trip to visit her college roommate in Savannah. She was gone for 4 days. I looked after my granddaughter, cooked her dinners, walked her to the bus stop. It was one of the better weeks I'd had in a long time. My granddaughter is bright and funny, and still young enough that a grandfather is interesting company. I found out 2 months later that my daughter had not gone to Savannah. She had been in Portland, meeting with a property management company about one of my Oregon rentals, representing herself as the successor trustee, inquiring about the possibility of renegotiating the lease terms on a property she had no authority over. The property manager, to his credit, asked for documentation and never heard back from her. By November, they had apparently decided that the slow approach was not working. Theodore spent about 4 hours at my kitchen table that Christmas morning. He made calls. I sat with the legal pad and wrote down every transaction I could remember, every conversation, every detail that felt relevant now, even if it hadn't at the time. Theodore's investigator, a woman who has worked with his firm for years, was on the phone with us before noon. She started pulling records. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I went to my bank's branch location, which was technically closed for Christmas, but whose manager had known me for 15 years, and came in when Theodore's assistant called her. I filed an affidavit reporting unauthorized transactions. I began the process of freezing the accounts and disputing the transfers. The bank's fraud team would need several business days, but the paper trail was being established. At 4 o'clock, I called a locksmith. My son-in-law's key ring had a house key on it. My daughter had her own. I had them both rekeyed. Front door, back door, garage side entry, and the storage building where I keep my tools and some items from my wife's estate that I have not been able to part with. I stood in the cold on my front porch and watched the locksmith work, and I breathed the winter air, and I felt something settle in my chest that I recognized after a moment as clarity. I was not the victim here. I mean, technically I was. I understand that. $40,000 gone. My trust, my good faith, my willingness to help, all of it taken and turned against me. That is what victimhood looks like on paper. But standing there in the cold, I felt something different. I felt like myself again. Like the person who had built a career by knowing what he had and protecting it, like the person my wife had believed in. I went back inside and made dinner for one, which I had been doing for 4 years and was not afraid of. My daughter called on December 28th. I let it go to voicemail. She called again that evening, and again the next morning. By the time the new year turned, I had 14 missed calls from her and 6 from my son-in-law. He left one voicemail, his voice carefully neutral, saying they just wanted to talk and that things had gotten out of hand, and he was sure we could work through it as a family. I did not return those calls. Theodore had advised me not to, and even without that advice, I would not have known what to say. Not yet. I was not ready to perform composure. I did not fully feel, and I was not going to have an emotional conversation that might later be used against me. I had not lived 67 years without learning that some silences are more powerful than anything you could say. Theodore filed a civil suit in the second week of January for recovery of the transferred funds, unauthorized use of financial accounts, and breach of fiduciary duty in connection with the Portland property inquiries. The complaint named both my daughter and my son-in-law. Copies were served to the apartment they had rented, with what money I did not ask, in a suburb of Portland. My daughter's attorney contacted Theodore the same day service was completed. She wanted to settle. She wanted to come back to the table. She was apparently shocked, genuinely shocked, that I had filed. I want to be honest about something. There were nights in January when I sat in the living room with the lights off and felt the particular loneliness of a man who has now outlived his marriage and, in the way that matters, outlived his relationship with his only child. I am not made of stone. I did not skip over the grief to arrive at the anger. I lived in it for a while. I missed my granddaughter with an ache that was physical. I missed who my daughter had been before she had become whoever she was now. I missed my wife in a new way, a way that included anger at her for leaving me here to handle this alone, which is not rational but is completely human. I said as much to my therapist, a man I'd started seeing after my wife passed and had continued with twice a month ever since. He did not try to reframe it for me or offer perspective. He just let me say it. That is what I pay him for, and he earns it. The civil case settled in March. My daughter and her husband agreed to repay the full $40,000 in a structured arrangement, monthly payments over 3 years with a personal guarantee from him as well. Theodore was satisfied with the terms. The Portland property inquiry was addressed in a separate agreement that formalized in writing what should have been clear from the beginning, that a successor trustee has no authority while the grantor is living and competent, and that any attempt to act in that capacity would constitute a breach with immediate legal consequences. My son-in-law went back to work eventually. Medical device sales again, different company, somewhere in the Portland area. I do not know the details, and I did not ask. My daughter called me in April on a Sunday evening, and I answered. We talked for 40 minutes. She cried. She said she was sorry that she had let him convince her that they were owed something, that the stress of the year had made her into someone she was not proud of. I told her I heard her. I told her I was not ready to pick up where we left off, but that I was willing to take it slowly, step by step, and see what was possible. I asked about my granddaughter. She was doing fine. She was in 2nd grade. She had recently lost her first tooth, and was very proud of the dollar the tooth fairy had brought her. My daughter put her on the phone for a few minutes. She told me she missed my waffles. I told her I would make them for her sometime. She said, "Okay, Grandpa," and her voice was very small and very certain, the way only the voices of young children can be. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while. The house was quiet in the way I have come to know over 4 years of living alone. A good quiet, mostly. The furnace running, the neighbor's dog barking twice, and then stopping. The particular stillness of a house that has held a lot of living and is not ashamed of any of it. I opened my laptop, checked my accounts. $39,814 in the trust's operating account, where it belonged. The first restitution payment had come through 3 days earlier, right on schedule. I closed the laptop. I made myself a cup of tea. This house still holds the shape of everyone who has ever lived in it. I feel that sometimes, in the early mornings especially. My wife in the kitchen. My daughter as a little girl running down the hallway in her socks. Versions of myself at every age, some of them foolish, some of them wiser than I gave myself credit for. All of them still here, in the walls, in the floors, in the light coming through the window at certain times of day. This is still my house. I am still the trustee. That has not changed. That will not change. There's a moment I keep coming back to, standing on my front porch in the cold while the locksmith worked, watching my own breath in the December air and feeling, of all things, like myself again. Not angry, not broken, just clear. I've thought a lot about how things got to that point, not to assign blame in the way people do when they want to feel righteous, but because I think the honest accounting matters. My daughter did not wake up one morning and decide to become someone capable of stealing from her own father. It happened in steps, small compromises, each one made easier by the last. Her husband whispered things into the space that grief had left open in our family, and she listened. And over time, the version of herself that would have been horrified by any of this got quieter and quieter until it stopped speaking altogether. That is how it works. That is how people lose themselves, not in one dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones they barely noticed. And I have to be honest about my own part in it. I trusted without verifying. I gave access without thinking through what that access could become in the wrong circumstances. I confused love with unconditional surrender. There is nothing wrong with loving your children deeply. There is something worth examining in the assumption that love makes betrayal impossible. It does not. Love is not armor. It is something more valuable than that, and more fragile, and it requires the same clear-eyed care that you would give to anything worth protecting. What saved me, what I keep coming back to, was not luck. It was that I had spent decades building the kind of judgment that does not panic. When I sat down at that laptop on Christmas morning and saw $400 where $40,000 should have been, something in me went very quiet and very focused. Not cold. Focused. I knew what I had. I knew what I was owed. I knew who to call. That kind of steadiness is not something you find in a crisis. It is something you build in the years before one. Decision, by doing hard things honestly, and not cutting corners and not pretending problems are smaller than they are. 31 years in commercial real estate will teach you that, if nothing else. The settlement came through in March. Full restitution, structured over 3 years, guaranteed in writing. Theodore called me when it was done and said simply, "It held." 2 words. I understood exactly what he meant. My daughter and I are finding our way back to something. It is slow, it is not what it was, and I do not think it will ever be exactly what it was. And I have made my peace with that. What I know is that she called me in April, and we talked for 40 minutes, and at the end of it she put her granddaughter on the phone, and that little girl told me she missed my waffles, and I told her I would make them for her sometime, and she said, "Okay, Grandpa." In that voice that assumes the world will simply cooperate. I'm going to make those waffles. That much I know. The house is quiet tonight in the way I have come to know over 4 years of living alone. A good quiet, the kind that belongs to a person who knows what he has, and protected it, and is still standing. That is enough.